My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the president of the Miami Law Federalist Society, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending this event this evening. The Federalist Society of Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the providence that the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks to both promote an awareness of these principles and to further them through its activities. For more information, about the Federalist Society, please go to the website at fedsoc.org. Many of you know this event was originally planned to occur as the University of Miami's Constitution Day event, but Hurricane Irma had different plans, and now it's finally here. And tonight, we have some wonderful guest speakers. Before I announce them, please keep in mind that all opinions expressed by the guests are those of the guests and not the Federalist Society. Dr. Marianne Franks, professor of law, teaches courses on the First Amendment, criminal law, family law, and law and technology. She's also the vice president and legislative and tech policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and frequently works with legislators and tech industry leaders to draft laws and policies to protect privacy and to counter harassment. Dr. Franks is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Cult of the Constitution, Guns, Speech, and the Internet. Her legal scholarship has been published in the Harvard Law Review, the California Law Review, and the UCLA Law Review, among others. She also has authored numerous articles for the popular press, including The Atlantic, The Guardian, and The Times Magazine. Dr. Franks holds a JD from Harvard Law School, as well as a doctorate and master's degrees from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Before she came to UM, Dr. Franks was a Bigelow Fellow and a lecturer in the law at the University of Chicago Law School, and taught social studies and philosophy at Harvard University. Dr. Charles Murray is an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he has been since 1990. Prior to his tenure at AEI, Dr. Murray was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research from 1982 until 1990, a research scientist at American Institutes for Research from 1969 to 1970, as well as 1974 to 1981. He also served as a volunteer for the Peace Corps and the United States Agency for International Development as a contractor in Thailand from 1965 to 1969. Dr. Murray is a political scientist, author, and libertarian. He first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. His 1994 New York Times bestseller, The Bell Curve, co-authored with the late Richard J. Herrnstein, sparked heated controversy for its analysis of the role of IQ in shaping America's class structure. Dr. Murray's other books include What It Means to be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishments, In Our Hands, Real Education, the New York Times bestseller Coming Apart, and his most recent book, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission, which urges Americans to stem governmental overreach and use America's unique civil society to put government back in its place. Dr. Murray has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BA in history from Harvard University. And tonight, our moderator will be the Honorable Paul C. Huck. Judge Huck received his Bachelor's of Arts degree in 1962 from the University of Florida, his JD from the Levin College of Law at the University of Florida in 1965. Judge Huck served in the United States Army Reserves from 1965 to 1972, and prior to his appointment to the federal bench, Judge Huck was in private practice in Florida from 1965 to 2000. Judge Huck was nominated by President Bill Clinton on May 9th, 2000 to the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. Judge Huck was confirmed by the Senate on June 30th of that year and received commission on July 11th. For over 20 years, Judge Huck has taught trial advocacy as an adjunct professor at the University of Miami School of Law, as well as served on the district court. Judge Huck, would you like to take it over?
Good evening, everyone, and Dean White, Federalist Society, thank you for inviting me. I think we'll find out. I want to follow up on Stephen's disclaimer. I want you all to know that as a federal judge, I have no, and I'm not allowed to have any opinions. So we're going to start with that. Except I do have an opinion about our guests tonight. We have two excellent and experts in the area which we're going to discuss tonight, even though both are graduates of Harvard. And I'm always suspect of speakers who graduate from Harvard and can't get into a good school like University of Miami and have to have Harvard as their safety school. But needless, I couldn't help but notice some extra security around the campus today, and I was unaware that Professor or Dr. Franks was such a controversial figure on the campus, and apparently she's given some pretty bad grades to some of the students around here. But we'll take good care of you, Doctor. In preparation for this event, and this is not an area of my expertise by any stretch of the imagination. So what I did was I did some deep research on the subject. I did what probably most of you do when you want to do your research. You go to the authority on pretty much anything. I went to Google, and I Googled this phrase. I Googled, quote, "Is free speech under attack on our campuses, college campuses," close quote. And up popped a whole series of articles. The first two were kind of interesting. The first one answered the question with an emphatic yes and gave a very forceful argument in the affirmative. The second article was very emphatically no and gave a compelling argument why that proposition is a complete myth. So it should be interesting to see what we'll come out with tonight. As I say, I'm not an expert in this area, but our speakers are. It seems to me that the status of free speech on campuses throughout our country is similar to beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. And tonight we have two pairs of eyes who are going to tell us how they behold their different versions of this particular subject. An observation I want to make, maybe in truth of our advertising, and one of our panel members suggested this was appropriate. This was advertised as a debate. Well, we're not going to have a formal debate format tonight. Instead, we're going to have an open, free-flowing discussion, hopefully, on this very broad topic, and we think it's going to be very interesting. And the topic, as I see it, is as follows: the university conundrum, free speech versus safe speech, and free speech versus academic freedom. Now, for any of those of you who are offended by the fact that we're not having a formal debate format, I've found out that the Federalist Society is prepared to pay back to you twice the amount that you pay for your ticket tonight. So take comfort in that. Now, the format is going to be something like this. It's going to be similar to something that I'm familiar with, and that's a trial. We're going to have opening statements, 15 minutes each side, followed by some questionings, and hopefully it'll be a free-flowing questions. I've instructed and asked our participants here to jump in at any time and become part of the ongoing discussion. If I direct my question to one, the other is invited, as a matter of fact, encouraged to jump in and give us his or her opinion. And then after we finish with the questionings, we'll have closing statements, and then we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so to have questions from you all. And that's how we're going to go. So buckle up, sit back, and we're going to start right now.
I am not going to give any statistics about changes in attitudes by students toward free speech and so forth. I think both Dr. Franks and I have read articles that have some of those, and we may end up talking about them. But I guess I want to talk about more subtle ways in which I think free speech on campus is under attack. It's not because of outside speakers coming in or being disinvited. People like me, outside speakers, I think, have very little effect on the campus one way or another. I think there is an extremely serious problem of freedom of expression in universities that is going on now, especially in the social sciences and humanities, and I think it's likely to spill over into the hard sciences, especially biology, in the not-so-distant future. I want to approach the issue in terms that I'm borrowing from Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, where he has talked about thinking of the telos of the university. Telos, the Greek word for ultimate objective, the word that Aristotle uses a lot in the Nicomachean Ethics to talk about the essence of something, of what it's good for. And what's the telos of the university? Jonathan Haidt asked. And he gave the examples of, well, in medicine, the telos is health. In law, the telos of the law is justice. And for the university, the telos is truth. It's an ancient and appropriate way of thinking about what universities are for, both in terms of what scholars are doing in universities, trying to expand the realm of things that we know are true or not true. And it's also, I think, appropriate to think of that in terms of what we're trying to do with students. Sometimes it is said that students were supposed to give them the best that has been thought and written. I think that's not a bad way of putting it, but we are also trying, I say we because even though I don't teach at a university, I feel like I'm part of that enterprise. We are trying to convey truth and ways of thinking about what the truth is and how it can be tested and how it can be falsified and how we can make progress. In all of those ways, it has been the continuing function of the university. Doesn't mean that a lot of falsity has not been taught by universities over the centuries, but the way that falsity has been countered is by a continuing pursuit of the truth. Over the last couple of decades, and it goes back, I think, probably 3 decades, there has been an alternative view that has gained influence as to what the proper function of a university is, and that goes by the label of the social justice movement. It has increasingly been argued, and in some cases has been argued, that the function of the university is primarily the advancement of social welfare. Brown University, for example, has taken a statement of its function which is very close to that. But in any case, it has been said that truth may be a good thing, but there are these competing interests of using the university as a force for good under the rubric of social justice, and why can't the university pursue both? Jonathan Haidt argues you can't do it that way, and I go along with that. Why can't you do it that way? Why must the sole function, ultimate function, of the university be truth? It's because the pursuit of social justice has taken on, I would argue, this is something I hope Dr. and Franks can get into dialogue about, has taken on the trappings of a religion. And any religious true faith, whether it be Orthodox Islam today or whether it be Christianity before Thomas Aquinas, severely constrains the search for truth because large chunks of intellectual inquiry are out of bounds when you have dogma that must be accepted as true, that cannot be challenged. How do I mean that the social welfare movement is a religion? Well, Jonathan Haidt says, first of all, it has sacred objects in the same way that religion has sacred objects. And he names 3 as being the big 3, blacks, women, and LGBT. He names an additional 3 that are sacred objects, Latinos, Native Americans, and the disabled, and argues that there have been more recent additions in the forms of Muslims, transgender issues, and Black Lives Matter. I don't know if that's exactly the right set of sacred objects, but I think some of those clearly qualify. Here's the point. Among these sacred objects, there can be no jokes. There can be no detached talk of utilitarian trade-offs, and also you can't just simply ignore them. A blanket commitment that transcends reason and admits of no deviation is demanded of the true believers. Now, that's a pretty extreme statement. If it seems too extreme, though, I've got a challenge for you. Someone give me an example later in the session of a joke about any of these sacred objects that passes muster, that won't get the teller of that joke in trouble. The second aspect of social justice these days is dogma. Dogma and blasphemy are two other signal characteristics of a religion. You must hold certain beliefs and refrain from blaspheming them. Haidt gives 4 beliefs. I had added a few more. The first, racism and sexism are endemic in American society, not just things that are still problems, but endemic and are major drivers of social problems. Victims play no role in arriving at their current state. Race is a social construct, not partly a social construct, completely a social construct. Gender is a social construct, exclusively a social construct except for the obvious difference in genitalia. There are no inherent group differences in personality, abilities, or social behavior. Affirmative action is good, and more is better. Once again, I'm going to ask you to give me examples of why I am overstating the case. For example, give me any inherent, inborn difference between men and women above the neck that it is okay to acknowledge. Any difference at all in personality, abilities, or social behavior, where you can say in a college classroom, without fear of anybody getting upset, well, actually, men and women are different this way because of biology. What are the effects in the classroom when you have this kind of quasi-religious dogma out there? Well, first, let me talk about the students. And I don't have numbers on this. I'm relying on many of you to think about your own college experience as undergraduates. First, think about the student who has a personal set of reservations about the dogma. He or she has to walk on eggshells in participating in class discussion, has to walk on eggshells in social encounters, cannot say the wrong thing for fear of being classed as one of the bad guys. The example that struck me most forcibly a long time ago was the degrees in which students in the classroom also have to fear the reaction of the professor. My daughter, Nerissa, graduated from Harvard in 1991. And when she was writing her senior thesis, she said to me very casually, just as a matter of course, that she'd had to stick some things into the dissertation, which was on English literature, reflecting the feminist opinions of her professor, because otherwise it would be taken out of her grade. And she just took that for granted. And I was stunned. This was 1991. A lot of this stuff had not gotten in the news yet. Again, I'm asking, does this sound familiar to any of you? The former ideal of the classroom, of an instructor presiding over an open but intellectually disciplined discussion among students, has become an anachronism among many faculty in many departments. The effects on the student who is a true believer of this kind of quasi-religious movement, I think, is to be very destructive. I think it encourages intellectual fragility. If you are told often enough you are supposed to be offended by something, you end up with microaggressions and trigger warnings and safe spaces and a kind of reinforcing cycle where a culture of victimhood takes hold. That teaches you that you are helpless, that you are under assault by other people or potential assault, and that you do not have the inner resources. You don't have the moral agency, if you want to put it that way, to resist these. You must be protected. You also, by the way, if you're truly afflicted by all that, have a real problem with the ability to function in the real world when you leave academia. Now let me turn to the effects on faculty. Among the true believers, they don't do scholarship that has any chance of producing answers they don't want to hear. That's most obvious if you look at the journals in women's studies and ethnic studies, where you are not looking at hypotheses that have been taken into research where the author was saying, gee, I wonder how this will turn out. The research is depressingly tendentious. But even in the American Sociological Review or other mainstream social science journals, the number of times that you encounter scholarship that is tendentious, that has started out intending to prove a point, and that has asked questions that will tend to produce the right answers is really depressing. Among the closeted non-believers, or ones who don't buy into the orthodoxy altogether, I think you have much more widespread effects. You have a lot of self-censoring of their lectures and a lot of fear of their own students. Think of Yale. Think of Evergreen State. Think of the faculty who have been forced out of their positions because of extremely innocuous things. The Yale is the best example of that. To openly criticize the orthodoxy, if you're a faculty member, whether it's in lectures or in print or faculty meeting, it carries a price for teachers on most campuses, and everyone knows it. That price may be investigation by the administration, protest by students, rejection of your application for employment if you are a new PhD, or denial of tenure if you are an assistant professor. But perhaps the most potent deterrent is to openly questioning the orthodoxy is social. Most people don't want to think that large numbers of their colleagues dislike them and look upon them as racist, sexist, or elitist. If you openly question the orthodoxy, that's very likely to happen to you. It's not just a matter of not getting invited to dinner parties anymore. It's a matter of living in a social sphere where you are seen as an oddball at best and as a bad person at worst. These harms to openly unorthodox faculty members, however, are trivial compared to the larger damage to academia. The hard sciences have been fairly immune, but otherwise the orthodoxy has devastated, in my view, liberal education. We have campuses where professors must be on guard against committing thought crimes, where they must placate students who clamor for protection against troubling ideas, where codes limiting the free expression of ideas are routine, and in which ancient ideals of scholarly excellence and human virtue are denounced. It is a parody of what the university was once expected to be. And there's one final problem. Those inviolable beliefs that I listed are all empirically wrong, in part, not entirely, but in certain respects. And the problem is particularly acute because in the hard sciences, especially genetics and neurosciences, they are unavoidably coming up with findings that don't square with the orthodoxy. I don't mean to have some dark image here of explosive findings that are coming out of genetics and neuroscience. No, it's actually benign. It's such things as, well, yeah, race is partly a social construct and it's partly a biological construct. Gender is partly a social construct and it's partly a biological construct. There's nothing scary out there, but the orthodoxy insists that these things cannot be at all. And the hard sciences are just going to sooner or later force a collision of what the orthodoxy says must be true and what's coming out of the laboratories. These faculty members, and there are thousands of them, are committing blasphemy. And sooner or later, the witch hunts, which is a particularly apt phrase for what's happening, will go after them. My prescription is simplicity itself. The telos of the university is truth. The ethics of the university are the obligations for everybody to make the case for their respective positions with evidence, logic, falsifiable hypotheses whenever possible, and always civility. Follow those rules, and nothing in the realm of ideas is alien to the university's mission. Thank you.
One of the things I always like to talk to my students about when we're trying to engage in the pursuit of what we sometimes call truth and sometimes we just call what happened, is I try to tell my students to be aware of certain rhetorical tricks, certain rhetorical devices that might knock us off of the path that we might be on in attempting to get at this truth. And some of those tactics are projection, right? Saying that there is another group that is doing the things that we ourselves are guilty of. And sometimes those tactics take the form of anecdotes being passed off as data, right? There's a couple of really terrible stories, very emotional stories that someone can tell, and that's presented as being the truth of a situation. And sometimes it's when intuitions and feelings are presented as though they are actual harm. So someone saying, well, I feel bad about this, or I feel uncomfortable about this, and therefore there's something wrong with the way that this is being treated. And so I think all of those things are relevant for having this discussion. These are things we should always be on our guard about, that we really want to make sure that when we have discussions that are purportedly in search of the truth, we should make sure that we're not falling prey to any of those particular fallacies or those strategies. Dr. Murray mentions, of course, that we should be concerned with truth at a university. I think that's as true for a law school as it is for a university. I think when we talk about truth, we need to think about what that actually means, that as a concept, as an abstract idea, we don't really know what that means. There are a couple of things I think we should probably think about when we're thinking about truth, and here are a couple of things that I think are relevant for our discussion and our topic. Here's one. As a group, white men are the only group in this country that have never been systematically discriminated against on the basis of their race or their gender. As a group, they have never been systematically denied opportunities employment-wise or in terms of their expression in public or in terms of the ability to move about freely in public. And as a matter of fact, right, and as a matter of truth, that has also correlated with the fact that in this country for over 200 years, perhaps unsurprisingly, that also means that white men have dominated government and the military and the educational system and the entertainment industry and basically every other type of field that we can imagine. Now, that's not because of superior merit, right? That's not necessarily because they are more qualified. It's because they cleared the field, right? It's pretty easy to win when nobody else is competing with you. So those are a couple of facts that I think we should probably consider. We are now living in a time, 2018, when Congress is 80% white and male, when the executive branch is obviously also white and male, when the Supreme Court is also white and male, and on top of all those things is conservative and white and male. Now, these are just observations. I hope I'm not offending anyone by observing them. These are observations that I would make in light of the fact that if we then think about the experiences of, let's say, women, people of color, people of different sexual orientations, if we ask what their experience has been like, it's quite different, right? Being locked out of certain professions, being locked out of certain opportunities, being unable to vote. There are lots of things that we could actually talk about historically that have put certain groups of society at a disadvantage to other groups. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we are facing now in 2018 is any number of problems, any number of acts of violence, any number of forms of discrimination against those particular groups. And that includes things like young men of color being shot dead in the street. It includes things like high rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment at workplaces and in schools. It includes things like discrimination and harassment based on sexual orientation or your gender identity. It includes things like anti-Semitic attacks, desecration of mosques and synagogues. It includes immigrants being rounded up in the middle of the night. It includes all of those things. So that's a little bit of truth. And so in this context and in this true world, we are told that there is a crisis of free speech and that the crisis is brought about by college students. It's an interesting concern and it's an interesting, shall we say, assessment of that particular concern. So let's talk about it. Could we worry about more than, let's say, free speech on college campuses? Certainly we could. We might want to worry about, for instance, war, surveillance, privacy invasions, inequality, discrimination. We might want to worry about all those things, but let's say that today we're going to focus on speech because it's always interesting. Okay. If we're going to say that free speech is under attack, well, that does seem like a good topic to have because we obviously all care very deeply about freedom of speech. Everybody does care about speaking freely. But it's another question to ask about why we would assume that the crisis of free speech is happening uniquely on college campuses. If we think about the fact that we have someone, and I don't know if this qualifies necessarily as a joke or not, but if you have someone who mocks the disabled and brags about sexual assault and calls for the death penalty for innocent men of color and gets elected president, you might say, well, actually there are certain types of speech and certain types of offensive speech, some might say, it's actually working out pretty well. You might say, right, in fact, that what we're looking at if we want to worry about freedom of speech in this country, not just as a college issue, we might want to worry about the fact that the President of the United States has openly stated that he'd like to open up the libel laws and rethink the First Amendment and perhaps restrict the press while he's at it. And on top of that, if anybody burns a flag, he thinks, you know what, you should actually go to jail or you should be stripped of your citizenship. And 56% of Republicans say he's right about that. I would say if we're concerned about freedom of speech, we should probably look at a couple of those things. We might want to look for other examples of fragility, right? Microaggressions, people getting really upset about things that they shouldn't get upset about. Maybe, for instance, for demanding the firing of Kathy Griffin because she posted a tasteless photo of herself with a decapitated Trump, protesting a Shakespeare play because you read it as an attack on Donald Trump because it was a production of Julius Caesar that seemed to imply that there was some sort of political valence to it. Criticizing people for kneeling during the anthem and saying that they should be fired, that seems like a problem for free speech. Maybe for booing Mona Charen as she speaks at the Conservative Political Action Commission because she's trying to point out the hypocrisy of Republicans in calling out sexual assault and not wanting to call it out in their own party. We might want to talk about that. And if we want to talk about violence, and if we want to talk about really the kind of intolerance that we should be worried about, we should probably look at all the organizations that are calling themselves proudly things like the Fraternal Order of Alt-Knights or the Proud Boys, who literally go around and train for fights with progressives because that's what they think they should be doing with their time. Or people who've literally assaulted journalists, or the fact that we can't in this country say with any confidence that we think that the right to freedom of press is actually protected any longer. I'd say that if we worried about free speech, genuinely, we'd probably need to worry about some of those things. But our topic is free speech on college campuses, so let's talk about that for a moment. I would also want to say that I find it peculiar that if we're going to look at campuses and we're going to talk about college students, I wish that we could also talk about some of the other things that I think college students have to worry about, not just about freedom of speech. There are some students who aren't sure where they're going to eat when the school cafeteria closes down for vacation. There are students who have to worry about the fact that they were sexually assaulted while they were in college and they have to face their rapist in class. There are some students who have to worry about the fact that they will be sexually harassed by their advisor and have nobody to tell that to. There are some people who have to worry about the fact that white supremacists are recruiting on their campuses and leaving nooses and swastikas. And there are some students who have to worry about the fact that a gunman may come onto their campus and shoot them all. So I'm very concerned about college campuses, and I'm worried about the free speech impact of all of those things. But if we're going to talk about free speech on campus and a concern about what happens, by all means, let's have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about Anita Sarkeesian. Anita Sarkeesian, as some of you know, is a feminist gaming critic. And she is known for criticizing the game industry for being sexist and for being racist. And she was scheduled to give a talk in 2014 in Utah at a university. And what happened the night before she could give her talk is that there was an email that was delivered to the administrators of that school that threatened to carry out the deadliest school shooting in American history if her talk was not canceled. And this particular author referenced Mark Lepine, who was the person who, of course, in 1989, in the name of fighting feminism, murdered 14 women at a university. And this email said, "I have at my disposal a semi-automatic rifle, multiple pistols, and a collection of pipe bombs. You have 24 hours to cancel Sarkeesian's talk. She's everything wrong with the feminist woman, and she's going to die screaming like the craven little whore that she is if you let her come to USU. I will write my manifesto in her spilled blood, and you will all bear witness to what feminist lies and poison have done to the men of America." I'm not sure if that qualifies as a joke either, but nothing, as far as I'm sure, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, actually happened to this particular anonymous emailer. Sarkeesian had to cancel her talk, not because she was put off necessarily by this threat. Shockingly or not, it was not the first threat of this type that she had received, but she had asked for a little bit of security at her event. And the university responded, this is an open carry state, and so we will not be providing any security of that nature for your talk. She did not feel that she could then guarantee the safety of the people who wanted to hear her speak, so she canceled her talk. That, I think, is a pretty bad sign for free speech. That's the kind of event that I wish had gotten more attention from some of the people who have weighed in on the question of whether or not we have a free speech crisis. There are lots of others. We can talk about all the university professors who have been fired because they were featured saying bad things about Donald Trump. We could talk about the person who tweeted out an offensive hashtag that white people thought was violent and got fired. That would be Johnny Eric Williams at Trinity. I'm sorry that Johnny Eric Williams had to go into hiding because of that statement. We could talk about, if we're worried about orthodoxy and dogma in the classrooms, I think we should probably talk about something called the Professor Watch List. The Professor Watch List is a website sponsored by the Turning Point USA organization, a right-wing organization that purports, or I should say the mission is, to expose and document college professors who discriminate against conservative students and advance leftist propaganda in the classroom. People are invited to send videos or articles about the fact that they have such a professor in their midst. So if we're facing the question of is free speech under attack on college campuses, yeah, I think we're probably not doing so well in terms of these particular sacred objects. I think some Black people, women, LGBT, they would be very surprised to hear themselves referred to that way. We are in a state at this point, in other words, where we have a situation where there is a rampant inequality and rampant discrimination and rampant violence against powerless groups, or at least groups that have less power than others. And what some of those particular students and individuals and groups have decided to do is to use their free speech to protest certain events and to advance their own views and their challenges to what they see as an unequal and unfair, rightly so, unjust environment. They're using, in other words, their freedom of speech to question the authority and the entitlement of the people who actually do have power. They are trying to say and to speak up and to say there is a problem here. I want to testify about my sexual assault. I want to challenge the person who is reporting me to the police that should not have done so. I am trying to speak up for the fact that my life, in fact, does matter. So I think we're seeing that on campuses, and that is probably on the whole a good thing. So what is the university's role when it comes to this sad state of free speech on campus? Well, I, unlike Dr. Murray, actually do, of course, teach at a university, and I have now for 15 years. I taught first at community colleges, I've taught at Harvard, I've taught at Chicago, and now, of course, I have the privilege of teaching here. And I can tell you that, of course, are students fragile sometimes? Are they in pain sometimes? Are they silly? Do they overreact? Are they occasionally hysterical? Of course, because they're people. And I see myself as a professor with at least some responsibility for trying to actually help them if they are in one of those states, as opposed to being terrified of them if they complain about me. So in the 15 years that I have taught, I can say that I have been gratified and humbled by the kinds of things that I have seen and experienced. When I was teaching in community college many years ago, I had a student come up to me after class once. It was a philosophy class. He came up to me and he said, "You are the first person in my life that has ever asked me a question, because no one has ever thought that I had anything to say before." I have had students come to tell me about their sexual assaults. I've had them come to tell me about the kinds of experiences they've had with law enforcement or with bosses or with friends or with family that have hurt them, abused them, have done things that you could not imagine, and that have nonetheless gotten up every day and gone to school and done the work. So yes, they have flaws, just like everyone else does. And yes, I think in the spirit of a university, not only should we care about the truth of their experiences, we should also be generous and be kind and not engage in a politics of contempt. And I also want to say that sometimes the kinds of courage and the kinds of bravery and the kinds of insights that students actually show is astounding. Today, for instance, as many of you in this room know, there were objections by some members of the community to Dr. Murray's presence. And what they have chosen to do, some of you chose to come anyway and to listen. Others decided to put on an alternative event. And at this alternative event, They've decided to celebrate what they consider to be their diversity. They've decided to celebrate the fact that they are a community, and they're doing all of this to raise money for a local community organization. I think that's a wonderful and life-affirming thing, and I think it is very much in the spirit of freedom. It is very much in the spirit of tolerance. It is very much in the spirit of bravery. So I would say, in response to this characterization of students as fragile, censorious, constantly weak, hiding from scary ideas, I would say perhaps you are just not looking in the right places. Thank you.
Dr. Murray, you argue that universities have or should have only one telos or goal, and that is truth. Maybe you can help us, because I find that a relatively vague term. I can visualize Socrates walking around the streets of Athens in his sandals, postulating about this absolute truth someplace. How does that fit in today's society, today's colleges? We only have one.
Share mics here.
In that case.
Well, I don't see that there's actually been that much change. So that if you go, let's start with the easy case, which is the hard sciences, and the hard sciences have much clearer statements of what they are after as evidence of proof, and they have much more rigorous standards than the social sciences have, and I say that as a social scientist. But actually in the social sciences, you get pretty much the same thing. When people are contesting empirical, falsifiable hypotheses, they are, when they're acting at their best as social scientists, they are saying, I am not only right and the other guy is wrong, but what I am presenting evidence for is closer to an ultimate objective truth about whatever the issue is. So I guess, Judge, the short answer is, I don't think it's changed much. I think the way in which the search for truth is most ambiguous in the arts and the humanities, but even there, I don't think it's absent. And in the social sciences and the hard sciences, pretty much as it's always been.
Dr. Franks, you agree, or do you think there's more than one goal that is appropriate for the universities?
I think it's inevitable that universities are going to decide for themselves what their mission is, and if we're talking about an undergraduate institution, it may be of one type. If we're talking about a professional institution, it may be something slightly different. But I do want to say just a couple of things about the idea that we can only have not even so much one goal, but that the idea that that goal is in inherent tension with other goals. I find the idea that truth versus justice is, as an idea, very strange. And I think a lot of people in the law school community would agree that if we're going to put any kind of substance or meaning to the question of truth, especially when it comes to something like law, it's going to have to be intimately connected to the question of justice. And if we even think back to classical examples of Socrates, I mean, what was he doing? He wasn't just going around speaking truth to the people who were enslaved or people who were suffering in the streets. He was talking to the people with power, and he was telling them, you're wrong about things. Or I should say, he was showing them at some point the error of their ways or the inconsistency of their principles. So that fundamentally, the prospect or the project of truth is about talking to people with power and about challenging the people with power and saying to them, you need to show why it is that you deserve what you have. You need to show why it is that we should obey you and your ideas. And so I think fundamentally, if we are concerned with the Socratic pursuit of truth, we have to be concerned inherently with questions of power and privilege and entitlement.
In your comments, Dr. Franks, you suggested that the idea of that Americans are intolerant of free speech is exaggerated. And for the first time in my life, I looked at Twitter, and I looked at your site.
I'm so sorry that I was
Yeah,
for that.
we've done a grave harm to this man.
That's right. I'm this generation, Dr. Murray. Anyway, in that tweet, you opine as follows, quote, American intolerance of free speech has been greatly exaggerated and is more likely to be found on the right than the left, and among non-college graduates than college graduates. And what do you base that conclusion?
Where did this come from?
A tweet.
Was it a tweet by, Dr.
By
Franks?
Dr. Yes, Doctor. It was out just this
I've
week.
gotta start
It was
following you.
March the 17th, as I recall.
Yes, it's a very recent tweet, very up to date on my Twitter feed, Judge.
As I say, you're the first person I've looked at their tweet.
So honored. Yes, so in this tweet, I am making reference specifically to an article that some of you may have seen. It's in Vox, and it's by Matthew Iglesias, and in it, there's a couple of similar pieces that came out recently, and it's showing some empirical information about studies that have been done about the so-called, or the kind of panic that we're having about free speech, especially among college students. Now, as Dr. Murray already referenced, there are studies that will say something different, of course, but there's quite a lot of really good empirical information to suggest that the idea that people are getting more intolerant over time is simply not true. And so in that piece, if you're interested, you can see the studies that they're citing to. Among them are Gallup studies. There's also the Cato study, and showing that, in fact, we are, as a general population, getting more tolerant, at least of certain forms of speech. And college students in particular are quite tolerant. And that if we're worried about intolerance, we probably need to be slightly more worried about people on the right, whatever that means, than people on the left, because it seems as though that there's much more willingness on the part of people who self-identify as Republicans to be censorious of certain forms of speech. And so that's what I was referring to.
And maybe we're misled somewhat because the news coverage seems to highlight those dramatic instances where there's intolerance. And they make for good news.
For people who want to pursue this, you can just Google Matthew Iglesias, and his recent works will bring that up. You can go to the Heterodox Academy, which is the one that Jonathan Haidt started, and they had a rebuttal to it. You will find that in the blog section of Heterodox Academy. There was on, I don't know how you pronounce it, Areo, a website. The title is The Reality of the Rise of an Intolerant and Radical Left on Campus, that was posted just a day or two ago. You can Google that phrase and get the contrasting numbers. I think a couple of points that stand out to me that come both from the Arrow article, which, by the way, is written by a person on the left, is we're actually talking about a fairly recent phenomenon. Jonathan Haidt places it as 2015 as being kind of a pivotal point, and the Arrow article also shows 2015, when you get successful disinvitations from leftist protests, when you get a variety of other evidences of, the kind of thing that happened to me at Middlebury, that it's not something that goes back 10 or 15 or 20 years. It has accelerated recently. And this leads to a question that I'd be curious to get Dr. Frank's reaction to, because in a way, when I talk about the growth of microaggressions and trigger warnings and safe spaces and these various things that have been in the news recently, people like me, old guys, saying, well, the young are just sort of spoiled brats these days and get off my lawn. I mean, there is that kind of sound to the way we're reacting to what's going on in undergraduates and college campuses. On the other hand, I also talk to faculty members who say to me that things have changed with undergraduates in recent years, that they are less mature than they used to be, they are more fragile than they used to be, they are more vulnerable, they are less confident, and the word is snowflakes. And so this is not an argumentative question, Dr. Franks. I'd like to know your own reactions. Are we just imagining this stuff?
So I can't speak with any authority about the current state of undergraduates because I haven't taught undergraduates for some time. And I would also want to just have the caveat that any answer I could give, of course, is going to be based on my own experiences as opposed to providing anything like an objective assessment of the state of undergrads today. And that's part of why I'm wary of these claims, and the reason why I'm a skeptic when it comes to these moral panics about college students is that there's over 20 million college students in America. That's a lot of students, and to make any kind of generalizations about who they are and what they're like and whether they're stronger now than they were before or weaker now, I think is probably a futile exercise. I'm much more interested in many ways to think about why it is that we are concerned with making these kinds of characterizations. What are we actually worried about? And so I guess what I would say in response is that, yes, of course, I've had students who seem a little bit fragile to me. For whatever it's worth, anecdotally, primarily the students that have seemed that way in my classes have been the ones who object that I am too much of a leftist and that I'm bringing in things that they are troubled by. For instance, talking about sexual assault in a context, well, when the subject of the class was actually sexual assault, and making mention of the fact that Donald Trump had bragged about sexual assault. One student found that very objectionable, which I found odd. So I can say, if I wanted to spin that out and turn that into generalization, well, you know what? There are just many students these days after Trump that are just incredibly fragile and sensitive about Trump. But I don't know that that would be a fair characterization because that's just my own experiences. And again, I'm not sure what the motivation really would be to try to make generalizations about students. I do think in some ways this is not a new argument. If you look at every generation when there's ever been social upheaval, you have had, how else to put it, the powerful people who are in the establishment sort of saying to the younger generation, we don't like how you're doing things, right? We don't like the way that you protest. We don't like the tactics that you have. We don't like the fact that you're disruptive. And this seems just to be another iteration of that.
Could I just jump in with one more comment, which we might pursue later, which is, I think you're right. You can't make generalizations. If I had to make a guess, I would say that it's a problem that's concentrated in elite colleges and especially smaller ones, where you do in fact have very high proportions of the undergraduates who are second and third generation upper middle class or richer, with parents who are highly educated, who have lived in fairly isolated enclaves. I've referred to them as bubbles in coming apart, and that they are also oftentimes have helicopter parents, and that you have in large public universities around the country, I would imagine that probably the great majority of undergraduates are pretty much the same as they have always been. I will throw out as a speculation that you probably have a higher concentration of young people coming to college from these elite backgrounds who are fragile in many of these kinds of ways. But as I say, that's speculation.
Well, is that unique to college campus, or is that our culture today?
Well, this is, again, I don't want to get bogged down in this. You have a multi-generation phenomenon that you didn't used to have. My dad graduated from high school, and so I grew up in an environment in which I was first generation away from watching people who made it up from the bottom. And I wouldn't be surprised if Dr. Franks doesn't have similar kind of experience. When you get to a situation where it's not only your own parents who were upper middle class and well educated, but also your grandparents, there's no grandparents to go visit during summer break where you're back in middle America, where you are outside of Scarsdale or outside of affluent suburbs. They, in a way, have been ensconced in a kind of homogeneous elite milieu that's kind of new in American history. We haven't had large numbers of people with that kind of multi-generational history.
Back to your point, Professor, or Dr. Franks, your comment was that college students are more tolerant of other people's exercise of free speech, even if they disagree with it, as opposed to general population. And I've seen some surveys that support that. But there's another survey that I want to ask you about, and that is, I'll just read you what the Google says on this. Again, I don't give you any guarantees it's accurate, but it seems, and people out there will probably know from their own experiences if it's true, but, quote, at Yale, 42% of students and 71% of conservatives say they feel uncomfortable giving their opinions on politics, race, religion, and gender. Self-censorship becomes more common as students progress through the university. 61% of freshmen feel comfortable gabbing about their views, but the same is true of just 56% of sophomores, 49% of juniors, and finally only 30% of seniors. Assuming that's true, why is that true, and how does it come about, and should something be done about it?
Well, I do I do wonder about these studies a little bit, because if we're asking the question, and I found that it's striking from Dr. Murray's remarks as well, the sense of self-reported discomfort, right, that certain people, especially conservatives, don't feel that they can speak anymore. And not to sound heartless, but part of me wants to ask, well, who cares? If we're actually trying to not talk about fragility and we're trying to say, well, maybe you shouldn't be so easily spooked by things that are disagreeable to you, then the fact that people feel uncomfortable expressing their views is not in itself a bad thing, is it? So, and I would like to point out, by some of the same people who would criticize that, or who do have those types of views, would say, you know, if a black student said, I feel uncomfortable or not confident, very often the response would be, well, that's because of your own issues. It's not because of us. And it would actually be turned around on them. So I'm not sure why we should have any more solicitude towards the feelings of conservative students than anyone else. And that goes double, because we're talking about, in some ways, the value of your ideas. Another conservative, shall we put it, cliche is the marketplace of ideas, right? We're supposed to believe in that. And if what you're really saying is, I no longer think that my ideas are going to find me a good audience in this marketplace, well, that's the market at work, isn't it? So if it's really true that you are feeling intimidated or concerned about how people are going to respond to what you say, I'm not sure what the harm of that actually is. It might actually be teaching you something that in other contexts would be called maturity. So we might just want to say that that's maybe all for the better without knowing more. So once again, I would really want to ask, well, what would be the harm? What is the harm of people feeling uncomfortable?
Well, and if you're talking about the other students are going to react negatively, I agree with you. You know, suck it up. If you've got an opinion, you ought to be willing to defend it, even though you run into opposition. So I agree with that. I think the problem comes when you think the teacher is going to take it out on you, that if you express a view, it's an anecdote, okay? It's a true anecdote about my daughter and her dissertation. And if you think that that teacher is going to give you a lower grade because that teacher knows that you have conservative views on issues, then you are in a power relationship of the kind which you rightly complain about, having been a problem in American history with white guys being in power. You have a power relationship of the teacher in a classroom. I want to give a good anecdote here, and it comes from Middlebury College. My daughter went to Middlebury, graduated from there. We love the place. Here's the good anecdote. She was taking a course in political philosophy in the fall of 2004 during the election campaign, which was a very hotly contested presidential election campaign. And about 6 weeks into the term, I said, you know, what is your professor's own political views? And my daughter sat and thought, and she said, I have no idea. That's what a teacher is supposed to be about. I'm quite confident, and in fact, I know who the professor was, and I've talked to friends of hers, and she was on the left. But she was teaching a course in political philosophy in an election campaign, and she didn't reveal what those views were. So that's great, and that was at Middlebury College, and it was in 2004. And I guess that I'm saying that surprised and delighted me so much, because in my experience, that's so rare, that you don't know what a teacher thinks just a few weeks into the course. And here's where I wish I could cite chapter and verse. You know, what percentage of teachers are like the political philosophy teacher? What percentage of teachers make it pretty well known to their students real quick where they are? I can't give you numbers on that. I guess I will appeal to people in the audience to go back over the courses they've taken as undergraduates and come up with their own estimate.
Let me get your views on this, follow up on that. I want to get both of your views on this. What about a professor, whether on left or right, who preaches his or her social or political bias to a class? Any comments about that? Because there are anecdotal matters, and there are matters where some have been disciplined and some have not been disciplined. And does it make any difference whether the class is a mandatory class or whether it's an elective class?
I guess I'd want to know what it means to preach bias, right? I mean, I suppose if you're teaching algebra and you start talking about your political views, yeah, I'd say that's a problem. But I don't know that it's a problem of, so much as this is a teacher who's talking about a subject that is not relevant to the class
Well,
material.
hypothetical. You're a first-year student here at law school, and you're in a course, contracts. Okay? Should we be talking about political arena? Should we be talking about candidates for presidency or local candidates or anything of that nature? Or
According to the principle of academic freedom, I wouldn't want to say to my contracts colleague what they should or shouldn't be saying in class, because who knows what a professor might find to be interesting or useful pedagogically. And I guess I do want to disagree with Dr. Murray on this idea that the best thing would be for someone to not know what their professor's political views are. I think I'd be more concerned with, is your professor a good professor? Are you learning anything? And whether or not you happen to know your professor's political views seems beside the point. It might even be more impressive in some ways to know, yes, I'm fully aware of what their political views are, and it has no bearing on what I'm doing in that class. So I think we'd ask the question about its relevance. We'd ask the question about its pedagogical impact, but I'd be much more wary of professors who pretend that they don't have any biases, the ones who present themselves to their classes as completely neutral and objective sources, because those are, I think, in my experience, the ones you really have to look out for.
in the ideal world, that may be okay, but we know of anecdotal instances where professors have just flat out, left or right,
Okay,
said, preach to their students, saying, this, and for you to talk to the students, for you to take a contrary position is silly, things of that nature. I mean,
I guess that I'm happy that Dr. Franks and I have finally identified something where, by God, I disagree with her. And it's this. I think it's really important that a teacher draw out of students, challenge students and draw them out, but play devil's advocate constantly, so that the point is not to preach in any way. I guess I'm saying it is a good, it is a positive good for a professor to take the role of, what I want to do is get these students to think about the material, and if they are coming up with the same kinds of conclusions I come up with, then what I'm going to do is challenge them on that and make them defend their position against the best arguments on the other side. To me, that's what teaching is all about.
Oh, then we don't disagree, because that's what law school literally is. And I think that it won't come as any surprise to any law school student that is what we do, in fact. And so I take it as some point of pride that when I was first teaching back in the day, I was teaching libertarianism. I was facing a room full of Harvard students who were very much anti-libertarians, and I was trying to get them to think through the best possible arguments on the other side. And we did, I think, have an interesting discussion. Afterwards, several students came up to me and they said, well, I just don't understand how you could be such a libertarian. And I thought, well, I guess I've done a good job today. But so I do think if that is the question, right, the Socratic idea that we are trying to find through a student's own exploration of their principles, their consistencies, their inconsistencies, absolutely, that is the job, I think, of professors in many cases. I won't say across the board, because I don't teach in many areas that I could speak that knowledgeably about. But certainly when it comes to law, certainly when it comes to certain forms of philosophy, humanities, of course I think for my own personal pedagogy, I do want students to challenge themselves. And wherever it is that I feel the students are, I'd like them to think about good arguments on the other side, not any arguments on the other side. One of the things I would want to be very cautious about is thinking that we need to be contrarian for contrarianism's sake, because simply throwing up devil's advocates arguments in themselves is not that useful. We want to find good arguments on the other side, and frankly, I think we shouldn't be afraid of the fact that sometimes there aren't really good arguments on the other side. I don't know that we need to relitigate in every class whether or not the Holocaust happened, so I think there are some things that maybe should be sort of out of bounds.
Within limits, I agree with that, yeah.
I'm puzzled, Dr. Frank, how can you even refer to back in the day?
I can't.
We know back in the day.
Which brings me back to your tweet, and I'm going to go back to that. Dr. Murray and I are the old fogies here tonight, and we lived through the...
Can I just say that Dr. Murray is quite the tweeter, so we just have to put that out there.
I'm not. But anyway, we lived through the 60s, and as those of you who may have read about it, and those of us who experienced, there was quite turmoil about free speech on campuses. In that time, there was, students were out burning flags, draft cards, sit-ins, taking over buildings, exercising their free speech, which turned out to be proper exercise of free speech. But at that time, the conservatives were concerned about this exercise of free speech. If you were back in the 60s, would your opinion be the same as it is in your tweet, that the attack on freedom of speech, or the exercise of freedom of speech, is greatly exaggerated?
Are you referring to me? Or?
Because it seems to me the shoe was on the other foot at that time.
And I guess I don't agree. I think that it really doesn't look that different. I mean, when you look at the movements of the 60s and 70s, I feel, again, that it's pretty much like what we're seeing today. It's primarily the establishment, and not to put too fine a point on it, a white, male, powerful, rich establishment that is complaining about everybody else. And I'm not sure how much of that has actually changed.
But you said in your tweet that today the conservatives are exaggerating the attacks on free speech because some conservatives feel they don't have access to exercise free speech. But it seems to me the reverse was true back in the 60s, where the conservatives were saying there's too much exercise of free speech.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, I do.
Would you have the same opinion that it was exaggerated?
I mean, this may be a little complicated for the purposes of this discussion, but I really do think that what's happened and what makes this conversation difficult is the way that we have now lost the sense of what words mean. We don't agree even on basic concepts anymore. So I think it's true that you could say conservatives used to be complaining there's too much free speech in the 60s, and then say, well, nowadays they're complaining that there's not enough. But I actually think they're still making the same arguments. They're just recharacterizing everything now that they realize that it's fashionable and it actually does get a lot of public support to speak in terms of the favors that we want to pay for free speech. I think simply the terms have changed. But I think it's still, if we really look at it in terms of, let's say, take the free speech lens off, what are we complaining about? We're complaining about the same people, the younger generation who's basically denying our authority.
Speaking for the older generation.
I'm thinking about the 60s again. And there was an inflection point in 1965-66, which in a way has made everything since then different from before. I graduated from Harvard in 1965, and when I left Harvard in June of 1965, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That was the ethos among the Harvard faculty. And it was the ethos that we as students were supposed to buy into. And it was it was taken for granted. It was part of the air, you know. That's the whole point of things. And I remember I was over in Thailand at the time, a year or two later, seeing protesters rocking Robert McNamara, Defense Secretary McNamara's car as he was visiting Harvard, and I remember just being shocked. I mean, truly, truly shocked. This can't be happening in Harvard Square because it's so antithetical to what I remember. But that judge, I would argue, in various forms ever since then, has been different. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, died in the mid-1960s and has never really made much of a comeback.
Talking about the oversensitivity of words and comments on campus and in society and public, I recall growing up as a young kid in Kentucky, a small town in Kentucky, and then coming down here to Miami. We were playing on the playground and someone would say something offensive to us. We would say in return, sticks and stones would break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Whatever happened to that?
Well, now, see, this is the danger when you're dealing with geezers, which is you give them a chance and they're going to run with it. And in this case, I have a gripe about the colleges that I've hinted at, but I haven't said outright yet, which is that I would argue that the colleges' administrations have changed the role of the college from being a bridge between adolescence and adulthood to being an institution that prolongs adolescence. In the good old days, back in the day, you go to college and your professor is no longer your friend, the way the teacher was your friend in high school. You go to college, and if you turn your paper in at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when it was due at noon, you don't have any excuses. Your paper doesn't count because it's late. And there were ways in which your relationship with the professor was sort of halfway between your teachers in high school and a supervisor-subordinate relationship in a job. The responsibilities that you had to deal with on your own, being away from your parents, were halfway between being in the family home and being completely out on your own. But you didn't have big res staffs to be available. You were supposed to be learning how to be an adult. And I guess with the elaborate res staffs and support systems and the chances to make up tests and the chances to miss deadlines and so forth, a variety of ways, I would say that what we're seeing with fragile students is in part a function of the different environment in college in which you are not thrown into cold water in terms of, you're on your own now, kid, in the same way that you once were, and that the college is acting in loco parentis in a much more literal way than it used to. Okay, is that sufficiently provocative?
No.
No.
I saw you taking notes, though. No comment?
No, I was actually doodling something.
Okay.
Sorry. But, so it seems like those are two very different kinds of questions. I mean, I think there's the point that Dr. Murray made is not one that again, in my own experience as a professor, of course there are things about some of you in this room that frustrate me, but there could be things that we might wish were different, but I don't, again, having done this for over a decade now, I don't see marked differences. There are obviously some students who are less professional, more needy. Of course, that's true. You can take any group large enough and you're going to find some of those. But I've also talked to students who are working 2 jobs and still going to class, who've had 3 children while they've been in law school. I mean, I'm talking to some incredibly hardworking students who are doing things that I never could have been capable of doing when I was a student. So those students put me to shame. And so perhaps I'm just really lucky here at UM, but I don't think that it doesn't resonate much with me, this idea that there's some kind of epidemic of fragility or adolescence among the students that I happen to teach. But so there's that part. But to the judge's question, I mean, about the sticks and stones and the question there, I think there's just what I would like to say about that. There's probably a good reason for us not to look to nursery rhymes for wisdom. It's not a very smart thing to say when we think about it, right? All of us know that words can hurt, and not in the sense of, oh, you offended me, because offensiveness is one of those slippery sorts of terms. When a Holocaust survivor is faced with a swastika, we're not just talking about someone saying, oh, that makes me feel bad. It's something different. When people show up in Charlottesville with, assault rifles strapped to their backs and say things like, I think that America should be a white country, that's not just words, and it's not just, something that people are going to get their feelings hurt about, right? These are people who are worried about their security and their safety and their very existence. And I think it's interesting to note that a couple of years ago, when Richard Spencer was gaining ground as a kind of alt-right leader, and he was holding meetings in D.C., and he was going through all the motions of what is, quite frankly, overtly fascist ideology, that the Holocaust Museum sent out a statement saying, it's important to keep in mind that the Holocaust did not begin with killings, it began with words.
In my defense, when I used sticks and stones, I was about 7 or 8 years old. I don't think I've used it till tonight. But I had a second part of that question was, are there some words that are the equivalent of sticks and stones that should be prohibited on campus or other places?
I think the example...
let me go on put another point on that. It's my understanding that you think that there's a difference between free speech on campus versus free speech in general, which you think, in general, you think you're an absolutist, that most anything goes short of crying fire in a crowded theater.
I think the examples that Dr. Franks gave are examples where a strong reaction is warranted, and strong condemnation of the people who did those things is warranted as well. And there is a big gap between that and the list of triggering phrases that the University of California publishes, which includes America as the land of opportunity, is a triggering phrase. Okay, so there's a continuum there, and I want to come down very hard on somebody who knowingly puts a swastika any place that well, I'm not crazy about putting swastikas anywhere, but with a Holocaust survivor. And I also do think that the rules of free speech are different on a campus than in the community at large. If I were the president of a university and somebody wanted to invite Milo Yiannopoulos, if I'm pronouncing his name right, to the campus, I'd say no. That what he deals in is invective. He deals in being as flamboyantly offensive as he possibly can. He is not making his case with evidence and logic and, above all, civility. And so free speech on the campus should be encumbered with rules. And they are the rules I just gave. That once you obey those rules, logic, civility, and evidence, then you can talk about anything. But a campus as an institution is justified in demanding those kinds of standards from people who are permitted to teach.
Well, you've indicated that the search of truth is the goal or the telos for universities. Do you have a view as to whether there are some objectively rejected propositions or positions or cases that shouldn't be allowed on campus? Things that have been rejected universally, such as people who say there was no Holocaust, the earth is flat, federal judges are biased in their opinions.
You're pushing things now.
They act arbitrarily. Are there such things?
Yeah,
that we
it's
just
a
absolutely say,
very small.
You can't talk about that on this campus.
Yeah, there's a very small set of such things, and you quickly go from things that really are settled science to things that aren't so settled. And I think perhaps the best example of that is climate change, where an awful lot of people want to say that's settled science, and that's not. We shouldn't be arguing about this anymore. And in fact, there are still things that's important to argue about. So here's I guess, my position. If somebody wants to come and give an evidence-based, logical defense of the earth is flat, it's not going to do a great deal of damage to let that person on campus.
Does it promote the search of truth?
It does not. This is like the old legal adage of, I think it's a legal adage that just because there is twilight does not mean there is not night nor day. And in the case of this, you've got a few twilight things which don't trouble me much one way or the other.
I promised our participants they could ask each other one question tonight before we turn it over to questions from you all. So
I already spent my question.
Dr. Franks, you can go.
Oh, thank you. So the question that I had for Dr. Murray actually relates to Milo. Some of you probably know that, or are aware of the fact that in many of these events, these controversial events, Dr. Murray's name gets linked with Milo's and others. And I believe at Free Speech Week, Milo had actually falsely put down your name and suggested that the two of you were going to appear at an event. Without telling you, and that your sense of being included possibly at an event with Milo was not something that you found to be acceptable. And so I was curious, given the fact that there are so many people who seem to want to put the two of you in the same category or assume that you are in the same category, given the fact that you object to that characterization, I wondered if you would be willing to talk about what you see as what really distinguishes the distinctions between you and someone like Milo.
I will preface it with, you said that I indicated that I did not want to appear with Milo. That was a tweet. I think I was asked why I wouldn't appear with Milo. I think my tweet was verbatim, because he is a despicable asshole. I was trying to avoid it.
Can you say that at the university?
Yeah, you can. You can get away with that. Dr. Frank's like, here's the good thing. What's different about it? Content, tone. I must have, I don't know, 50 hours, 100 hours on YouTube of lectures I've given in colleges and Q&As that have gone on. And I guess that I would challenge anybody to find any response to a student question where I did not take the student seriously and and respond seriously, that you will not be able to find a single example where I, by implication or directly, insulted a student, or I would like to think that I haven't even made students uncomfortable with any of my answers. And that's just about as far from Milo as you can get.
Do you have a question, or have you already taken care of that?
Yes, I'd already asked her, you know, to what extent are we old guys making this stuff up? Are we imagining it? And Dr. Franks
Yes, we
responded
are.
adequately for my purposes.
But old age is an excuse for a lot of things, including that. We're pretty much out of time, so I think I'm going to exercise my judicial prerogative and eliminate the closing arguments, and spend a few minutes to see if some of our audience have some questions. Oh, right away. Stand up and speak loudly.
Sure. I have a question.
And tell us who you are. Are you a student here?
No.
Lawyer?
Thank you. Yes, I'm
All right.
So my question is for Dr. Franks. And if I misunderstood your presentation, I apologize. But you raised a host of issues ranging from our president's personal shortcomings to personal problems that some students might face, including wondering where their next meal is coming from, and you identified other societal issues which may or may not be problems, but I'm not sure that I understood precisely how that related to Dr. Murray's central thesis, which I understood to be that universities are fostering an environment of orthodoxy and dogma where the open discussion of certain ideas are prohibited, or at least inhibited by written or unwritten codes of conduct. And so with regard to that thesis, my question is twofold. First, would you acknowledge that at least in some universities, there is this environment in which the discussion of certain ideas or challenging certain ideas is kind of off limits? And second, if you would agree that this environment exists, would you also agree that it's incompatible with the idea of a university as a place where the free exchange of ideas should be encouraged? Or is it your position that, yes, this happens, and yes, it may be a problem, but we shouldn't care because there are other problems in society too, or because people who are complaining about it are often conservative or are white males, and so it's not an important problem?
Dr. Franks, before you answer that, I just want to point out, just in case you didn't notice that the final argument has just been usurped. I think we just heard it.
So I want to clarify that I'm not actually interested in President Trump's personal problems, except in as much as they become the country's problems, which is, it seems like, always. And the reason why we have to care about that is because if you have the highest official in the United States expressing animosity, direct animosity, towards the First Amendment, towards a free press, towards people who actually are speaking out and using their rights, I think that is a cause of real concern. And part of what my presentation was about is a questioning, right, of what we consider to be a real threat today. And I think that when it comes to just the free speech question, we should be very concerned about the fact that people with power are threatening other people with less power precisely when they exercise their free speech. So we can take the example of the flag burning tweet, or we can also talk about Colin Kaepernick, because who doesn't want to talk about that, right? We have a president who goes out of his way to say that this is a person and people like him should be fired from their jobs because they exercise their free speech that he found offensive and didn't like. If we're going to look for troubling examples of intolerance and fragility, then I think that we should care very much about what the President of the United States says and does. So that was the point of focusing on this. Now, as to the question of other problems, yes, I think that we need to care about college students in lots of ways. I don't know why we're looking at them with such a form of scrutiny to solve all the problems about free speech, when I do think, in fact, there are far greater threats to free speech. I mean, after all, a woman literally went to jail for laughing during the confirmation hearing of Jeff Sessions. She laughed at the suggestion that he had always equally treated people, that he treated people equally and well. So she laughed at that, and she was put in jail. That is the kind of thing I think as a country we should worry about. So it's hard for me to get as concerned about the question of, well, is it possible that on one of the thousands of college campuses in the United States today, there are some times when students are having some problems with uncomfortable ideas, or that they want to escape some of the disagreeable conditions in which they find themselves? I mean, I think we should be worried about them on a case-by-case basis. Some of them are obviously alarming, many of them are not. And until we actually have some real evidence that there's harm here, that this is actually having a detrimental effect on our society, I'm not sure why we're spending all of our energy and resources on it. And it's not because we shouldn't care about college students. We should. We should very much care about universities and their dedication to freedom of speech. But part of that is going to mean paying attention to context and nuance and asking more than just the spectacle question. That is to say, can I make it seem like the student seems fragile or ridiculous today? What I really reject here is this kind of attitude of contempt towards students and ridicule. If we do think something is wrong on these campuses, I think it would behoove us to actually figure out what the underlying causes of that might be, because after all, college students are not in control of this country. So if there is a problem there, then I think those people with power and resources have a responsibility to do something about it.
I don't think there's a criticism or a ridicule of students per se. I think it's a ridicule of students with whom you disagree, whichever side you're on. That seems to be what's going on here.
Just one sentence, which is, I'm actually very worried about faculty members who cannot take on subjects in their research without social ostracism or penalties from the administration. We haven't said much about that.
Let me ask you, can we stay for a while? You all have a problem staying? I think we're kind of getting cranked up. Yes, sir.
I have a follow-up question for Professor Frank.
Stand up so we can see who you are, and use the mic if you would.
Ed Vidal, I'm general counsel of an online media company. I know I look too old to be that, and I was a University of Chicago class of '81, and my Bigelow fellow was great, teaching me to write somewhat.
The program's really gone downhill since then.
Yeah, no. But my question is, Professor Franks, why do we still have this problem when America just duly elected twice a young, colored, progressive president? I mean, when are we ever going to solve your problem?
I don't know how to answer that with all honesty, and I think that, and I'm not sure if this gets at the heart of your question or not, so forgive me if I misunderstand, but I think we're having the problems we have today because we had 8 years of an African-American president. And I mean that in the sense that we are experiencing a backlash. I think that when we look at what happened in the last few decades in this country, it has been, in some ways, the first time the monopoly of power has actually been threatened, right? I mean, in a really extreme sense, right? So you have 8 years of an African-American president. He's in charge, and he's providing this model of grace and dignity and education and family cohesiveness, all of things that we don't see anymore, right? It used to be that we valued those things, and suddenly now we don't, apparently. And so I think that what's happened is that we're experiencing a kind of massive cultural cognitive dissonance, which was that there is proof, right, that we don't need to simply adhere to the old way of things being done. So you had 8 years, the first African-American president, and you had, for the first time, a viable political candidate who happened to be a woman. And I think at that point, America collectively lost its mind. So I think that that's what we're experiencing now, and until we figure out those underlying issues, we're not going to get anywhere.
Over here, gentlemen. One of my students.
Yeah, my name's Adam Stoltz. I'm a third-year law student here at the university. My question's for Dr. Murray. Would you mind, just to help all of us understand your discussion, defining the word truth? Because that seems to be, my question for Dr. Murray, would you mind defining the word truth? Because that seemed to be sort of the fulcrum of much of your discussion, and to the extent that the definition includes the word fact, because that's something that I think, a word that we also heard a lot, what would be the definition of that, since facts seem like something, objectively that could be manufactured quite easily today and passed off, between person to person. Thank you.
So, by the way, you must forgive me, my hearing is not all it should be. You're asking me to be more precise and talk, what do I mean by truth?
Your definition of truth, and if it includes the word fact, the definition of fact.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I talk about the definition of truth in universities is, are we working with a hypothesis about something in the world that is falsifiable? And to be falsifiable, there must be facts, there must be evidence that are brought to bear. I don't have a definition of fact, or for that matter of truth, that would pass strict scrutiny off the top of my head. I will say though, that the loss of a sense that facts are real and facts are not subject to dispute is very, very bothersome to me. Pat Moynihan was famous for saying, he was quoting somebody else actually, that everybody's entitled to his own opinion but not to his own facts. And we are seeing now, as far as I can tell, not only in the national political stage, but also within universities a lot of times, where people are unwilling to agree about what the facts of a situation are. So whatever the correct definition of it is, there is such a thing as a fact that can be substantiated and that we all have to accept, else dialogue and progress becomes impossible.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Alan Bloom, in his 1987 book, The Closing of the American Mind, said that one of the problems with the failure of American education was the decline of the Aristotelian concept of truth, logic, and the Socratic teaching that had been enshrined in the Enlightenment through John Locke, and the overemphasis of relativism, Eastern philosophy, socialism, and generally the Marxist ethos of the later part of the 19th century. One thing that we didn't talk about tonight was we are seeing across the United States, and not isolated incidences, of large levels of violence, of shouting down speakers, attacking speakers. We only see that in the United States. However, when we look abroad internationally at places like Oxford or Cambridge, the idea of attacking a speaker or shouting down a speaker, there would be so much just social animosity that would just check an individual before they would even do that. So what do you think is different here in the United States than what we are seeing in other parts of the country or in the world?
Is that for me?
Yes.
I'm not sure I agree with your premise. I don't have the evidence to say that you're wrong about Oxford. I have a feeling that Oxford, well, they certainly haven't invited me to speak recently, and I don't know of people who have been invited to speak at Oxford or debate at Oxford about the elements of the dogma that I talked about male-female differences, about a variety of affirmative action. I'm not sure that Oxford is any more open to that than American universities are. Professor Franks has been there more recently than I have and could respond to that better. What's going on in the United States? I kind of think it's disconnected. I think postmodernism was a catastrophe in the university. I think its role in saying, well, you know, there is no such thing as objective truth was disastrous in all sorts of kind of theoretical ways. What's going on now, I think, is much more basic. It's much more visceral. My wife has a theory that I think has a lot of truth to it, that the anger at Donald Trump is so deep that anybody who is identified with the right is sort of an avatar for Donald Trump when we show up on campus. And so even though I personally have criticized Donald Trump in really pretty much the same terms I criticized Milo in, that doesn't protect me. And I think there is an element of that enormous anger generated by the election of Donald Trump, which coincides with an upswing with a lot of these events. That's my speculation.
If you set aside the reference to Oxford, though, I think the point was, why do some students think they have a license to barge in and knock down somebody or tear down a building or barricade people who are trying to exercise their rights of freedom of speech, even though it may be hurtful to a lot of people? I think that's the point I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't have an answer for you on that. I've thought about it a lot. You know, I'm sort of, somebody who's been in an airplane crash is not automatically an expert on aircraft design, and that's been kind of my experience. I've been in the crash. I don't really understand how it got there.
I just want to say a couple of things about that, which is, First of all, I don't think it is true at all that we don't see these problems elsewhere. They're not unique to the states at all. But I think the deeper point is not just the spectacle. Again, you can get really good footage out of someone shouting down a speaker. I'm not so sure that I would say that that's violence. I think I would reserve that term for violence. But I do think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that for basically every female academic I know who's ever been featured publicly or prominently speaking out on any issue, she has faced, on average, something like 10, 20, 30 death threats and rape threats. And for those journalists, for instance, who happen to be Jewish, they routinely get sent things like, you should have died in the Holocaust, and they get sent photoshopped images of themselves at concentration camps. So when we're talking about this kind of rudeness of people shouting down speakers, well, I agree that's rude. If we're going to care, though, about chilling people's speech, let's talk about the number of people of color and women who, every time they speak, are not simply shouted down, they are given death threats and rape threats, and I've personally experienced both of those. And every day, nonetheless, they get up and they do what they do. And they don't jump in front of a camera and whine about how people don't like them. So if we're going to talk about chilling speech, and we're going to talk about the fact that some people actually have to undergo some quite serious and in some cases violent intimidation because of the way that they are or the things that they say, then by all means let's talk about everyone who has to face that and talk about the ones who are not necessarily going to make it on the evening news.
So you agree?
I have never jumped in front of a camera and whined, Dr. Franks, not one single solitary time.
I think most fair-minded people would agree with that, you know, some of the examples you used are just beyond the pale. But they didn't answer the question about the violence, you know, knocking somebody down, beating someone up. Ironically, in the incident involving Dr. Murray, the professor, what was her name?
Professor Stanger.
Stanger, who was there as a counterpoint to Dr. Murray, was the one who came out on the worst end of that. She ended up in the hospital.
But I do want to point out that that did happen, and subsequently everywhere I've appeared, including here tonight, the security has been so good that nothing like that has occurred since. I guess what I truly am unable to get my mind around is that on campuses, so many students do think it's okay to shout down positions they don't agree with. I agree that's not violence. It's unfathomable to me. I know it's rationalized by deplatforming people and so forth, and here I simply say, this is a university. Why isn't everybody really upset at this?
And I just want to clarify that I wasn't speaking of you, Dr. Murray, when I was talking about the whining.
I'm very sensitive to that.
I imagine so. And I
was
want to emphasize the fact that I think that what happened at Middlebury was shocking and appalling. And of course, that is exactly the kind of situation that we should be worried about, because it was all the things that you described. What I'm more concerned about are the Milos and the Richard Spencers of the world who frankly provoke violence, because as we may know, at 2 of Richard Spencer's appearances, supporters of his have shown up with guns and have pulled them on the crowds. At one of the protests against Milo, one of Milo's supporters shot someone in the stomach. So if we're going to talk about violence, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the fact that there really is quite a lot of violence around these events, but they're not coming from the so-called leftist fragile students, right? So we need to talk about that. And I think that it's really important that we keep all these things in mind, that when we're talking about the costs of free speech, we shouldn't just focus on some of the things that actually happen to make the news. And we really do need to focus on the difference between violence and protest, because whatever else we might want to call it, peaceful protest is a form of free speech. And if we don't like that speech and we're saying we're offended by it, well, guess what? The entire lesson, I think, of Dr. Murray is that we got to suck it up.
Take one more. It's 9:15. I think it's, well, 10 of 9 almost. Who is, Dean, why don't you pick somebody? You know somebody who might have. I'll tell you what, let's keep the question short. How's that? Looks like a short question right there.
Just pick one vote.
I just did.
You won't be accused of favoritism that way.
My question is directed to both Dr. Murray and Dr. Franks, and it is really quick, but what I'm really curious, like leaving this room today, is to know, because I feel like the severity of the issue is debatable, but the fact that the issue exists is not, at least in my mind. As coming from a student's perspective, where as students,
And your question is?
okay, we accept the fact that there's bias in the faculty, and also the fact that some students are fragile. So my real question is, what is the real problem here? Is it the faculty and their biases, or is it the fact that the students are fragile and that they cannot deal with differing opinions?
Okay, I'll quickly clarify. There are two aspects to the problem that I dealt with, and one of them is the effects on the students, which has occupied actually more of the time in the discussion. And the other is the effects on faculty, who do not fully buy into the orthodoxy, plus faculty who are engaged in research which is dangerously in conflict with it. And I am equally, if not more, concerned about the effects of that in discouraging free academic inquiry and in also creating exactly the opposite atmosphere on college faculties that should exist of colleagueship and open inquiry and go where the data leads you. I think in many ways that's more dangerous in the long run than what is going on with the students.
I think we have to confront the fact that everyone is biased and everyone is fragile. And the sooner we actually talk about that and we're honest about that, I think the better we can be equipped to talk about difficult issues and to say the reason why we're having trouble having a conversation is because of those biases and fragilities. I think one thing we're definitely going to have to move past is trying to say, well, that group of people is biased and that group of people is particularly fragile. I think that that is exactly what's going to keep us in this bad state of affairs where we are now. We are really going to have to say we are all fundamentally flawed, limited human beings, and hopefully universities are there to cultivate what's best in us and actually to expose us to challenges and to radical ideas in some cases, and we are going to have the opportunity and the security and the boundaries, the rules of engagement that will actually make it possible, like in this conversation, to have a civil discourse about those difficult issues.
Now, as a federal judge, I said I cannot have opinions, so I don't have opinions on this, but if I had an opinion, I would join that opinion. And I think that's a good way to end it tonight. So thank you very much.